The wedding hall was filled with laughter and music, the kind of lively energy that made it impossible to find a quiet moment. Guests moved through the large space, greeting one another, clinking glasses, and exchanging stories about how long it had been since they last met. The air smelled of roses and expensive cologne, a mix of elegance and celebration. I arrived with my husband James, who had barely stepped through the doors before he was pulled away by a group of relatives. He had been looking forward to this wedding for weeks, excited to reconnect with family he had not seen in years. I watched him disappear into the crowd, his arm wrapped around an uncle's shoulder as they laughed about something I could not hear. I stood for a moment, adjusting my dress, trying to ignore the feeling of being alone in a sea of people I barely knew. James came from a large family, the kind that thrived in events like this, but for me, it was different. I had always struggled to feel like I belonged in these settings, always careful not to intrude on inside jokes or old memories I was never a part of. I reminded myself that I was here to support James, to smile when necessary and engage in small talk with whoever happened to cross my path. I moved toward the bar, hoping a drink would make me feel less out of place. As I waited for the bartender to finish with another guest, I heard a voice beside me. "You must be James's wife." I turned to see a man standing next to me, his expression warm, his posture relaxed. He was tall, well-dressed, his dark suit fitting perfectly on his broad frame. His eyes held something unreadable, though his smile was easy and confident. "I am," I said, offering a polite smile. "And you are?" "Ethan," he said, extending his hand. "Cousin." I shook his hand briefly before letting go, unsure if I had met him before or if this was our first introduction. "Nice to meet you," I said, keeping my tone light. "I feel like we should have met before," he said, studying me for a moment. "James talks about you sometimes." I raised an eyebrow, curious but uncertain about how to respond. "Hopefully good things." He laughed, nodding. "All good, don't worry." The bartender slid my drink toward me and I took a sip, grateful for something to occupy my hands. Ethan did the same, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. "I have to say," he continued, his tone casual, "you don't really seem like the type to enjoy these big family gatherings." I smiled, though his observation caught me off guard. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged. "You seem different, not in a bad way, just more reserved." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I guess I just do better in smaller groups." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words carefully. "That makes sense. You seem like someone who watches before speaking. You take things in." There was something about the way he spoke that made my skin prickle. His words were harmless, but the way he said them felt a little too familiar. I nodded, deciding to keep the conversation short. "It's a lot to take in," I admitted. He smirked, swirling the drink in his glass. "It is? But you stand out, you know. Not just because you're James's wife." I stiffened slightly, my grip tightening around my glass. I knew how to handle compliments, but there was something different about this one. The way he said it, the way his eyes did not waver, made it feel like it carried more weight than it should. I forced a polite smile, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, someone called his name from across the room, giving me the perfect excuse to step away. I nodded, mumbling something about needing to find James, and quickly moved toward the other side of the hall. The night continued, and I did my best to blend into the background. James was still busy with relatives, caught up in conversations that had nothing to do with me. I smiled when necessary, laughed at the right moments, but I kept my distance from Ethan. Something about our conversation left me unsettled, though I told myself I was imagining things. As I made my way toward an open table, I felt someone move beside me. Avoiding me already? I turned to see Ethan standing next to me again, his smirk still present, his eyes watching me closely. I forced a light laugh. Not avoiding, just mingling. "Right," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "You seemed like you were looking for an escape." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He was observant, and I was beginning to feel like there was no way to deflect his words without him seeing through me. He stepped slightly closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. "I get it," he continued. "Big family events like this can be overwhelming." I nodded, my heart beating slightly faster for reasons I could not explain. "Yeah, it's a lot of people," he smiled, his gaze holding mine. "You don't have to be polite with me, you know. I can tell when someone's uncomfortable." I swallowed hard, shifting slightly. "I'm fine." He tilted his head as if he did not believe me. "James is lucky, you know, not just because of how you look, but because you actually listen. Most people don't." I forced a laugh, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. "I think you might have had too much to drink." "Maybe," he said, still watching me. "Or maybe I'm just saying what's obvious." I cleared my throat, stepping back. "I should find James." His smirk did not fade, but he nodded. "Of course." I turned quickly, making my way toward where James was still engaged in conversation, unaware of the way my hands trembled slightly. The night was not even over, and I already knew this was not the last time Ethan would find a reason to stand too close, to say just enough to make me question if I was imagining things. The evening continued, and the energy in the wedding hall remained high. Laughter and conversation filled the space, creating an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. James remained engaged in conversations, moving from group to group, completely at ease in the familiarity of his family. I tried to do the same, speaking with relatives, responding politely when asked how long we had been married, how life had been treating us, and whether we were thinking of having children. The same expected questions, the same expected answers. Ethan appeared at random moments, always nearby, always lingering. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. It was natural for cousins to move through the same circles at a family gathering, but there was something about the way he positioned himself, the way he seemed to appear the moment I was left alone, that began to feel intentional. Each time I turned, I felt his gaze before I saw him. It was never obvious, never direct, but there was something unnerving about it, a slow awareness that grew the longer the evening went on. At one point, as I stood by the bar waiting for another drink, I felt a light pressure on my waist, a touch that lasted only a second before it was gone. I turned slightly, expecting someone to be passing by, but instead I found Ethan standing close behind me, his expression unreadable. I stepped away, putting space between us, but he acted as if nothing had happened. "You looked lost in thought," he said, his voice calm, smooth. I gave a polite smile, ignoring the way my skin felt warm where his hand had just been. "Just taking it all in." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "It's a lot, I know. You don't seem like someone who enjoys these kinds of things." I forced a light laugh. "Big crowds aren't really my thing." "I figured," he said, tilting his head slightly as if reading more into my words. "You watch more than you participate." I shifted, feeling uneasy. "I like to observe." "Smart," he replied. "Most people talk too much without noticing anything." I nodded, hoping the conversation would end there, but he continued. "James hasn't been around much tonight," he said casually. "I think he's forgotten you're here." The statement caught me off guard. I glanced across the room and saw James laughing with an older relative, completely unaware of anything happening on this side of the hall. I forced another smile, dismissing Ethan's words. "He's just catching up." Ethan smirked slightly, his gaze steady. "You're good at making excuses for him. I took a slow breath, unwilling to continue this conversation. I should go find him. Ethan nodded but didn't step away. Of course. I turned before he could say anything else, moving toward the crowd, determined to find James. My heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. I knew Ethan's words were meant to get under my skin, to make me second-guess things that did not need questioning. But I would not let them. The discomfort did not fade. I felt him before I saw him, always within sight, always appearing just close enough to remind me of his presence. I laughed at the right moments in conversations, responded when necessary, but my mind remained unsettled. I avoided looking in his direction, but even then I knew he was still watching. I made my way toward the doors leading outside, needing fresh air, a break from the heavy warmth of the crowded hall. The night air was cool against my skin, a welcome relief. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes briefly, allowing myself to feel normal again. The relief did not last long. I heard the door open behind me, followed by the quiet sound of footsteps. I knew before turning that it was Ethan. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral as he stepped beside me. "Needed a break?" he asked. I nodded, wrapping my arms around myself, just for a moment. He leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. "I get it. Nights like this can feel suffocating." I did not respond, hoping that silence would end the conversation, but he continued, "You don't really fit in with this family, do you?" His tone was soft, not accusing, just observant. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You're not like the others," he said. "You don't just go along with everything. You think before you speak. You see things that other people don't." His words made me uncomfortable, not because they were false, but because they were too perceptive. I shifted my weight slightly, choosing my response carefully. "I just try to stay aware of things." He smirked, as if I had confirmed something he already knew. "That's why I notice you." I stiffened at his words, forcing a small laugh. "You've had too much to drink." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm serious." I exhaled, glancing toward the hall doors, debating whether to leave. I did not want to be here, not with him standing this close, not with the way he was looking at me. "I should go back inside." He did not move. James won't notice if you're gone for a little longer." My stomach twisted at his words. "I think you should stop." His smirk did not fade. "I think you should stop pretending." I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. "What is that supposed to mean?" He stepped closer, just slightly, his voice quieter now. "You didn't pull away earlier." I swallowed hard. "That doesn't mean anything." His gaze held mine for a long moment. "Doesn't it?" The weight of his words made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I need to go." Ethan exhaled, stepping back slightly. "Of course." I turned without another word, walking quickly toward the hall doors. My heart was racing, my hands shaking slightly as I pushed them open. The warmth and noise of the wedding greeted me, but it did not feel comforting. It felt like a false sense of security, a fragile barrier between what had just happened and what I wished I could forget. I moved through the crowd, searching for James. When I found him, he was still laughing, still unaware. I forced a smile, slipping my arm through his, grounding myself in his presence. He turned to me with a warm expression, pressing a quick kiss to my forehead before continuing his conversation. I should have felt safe, but I didn't. Ethan's words still echoed in my mind, his presence still lingering too close. I knew this was not over, not yet. The music filled the hall, the beats steady, the voices of guests blending together into a hum of laughter and conversation. The dance floor was crowded, couples swaying, groups of friends moving together in rhythm. I stood at the edge watching, feeling the warmth of the room, but not entirely part of it. James was nowhere in sight, lost somewhere in the sea of guests, caught up in conversations that had stretched late into the evening. I told myself I did not mind, that I was fine standing alone for a moment, taking everything in. Ethan appeared beside me without warning, his presence so close that I felt the heat of him before I even turned my head. His voice was smooth, casual, as he spoke just above the music. He asked me to dance. The request was simple, the kind that could have been innocent, but something in the way he said it made me hesitate. His eyes held an expression I could not quite read, something amused, something too certain. I glanced around quickly, searching for James, for an excuse, but there was nothing. The hesitation was enough for Ethan to take my hand, his grip light but firm, as if he had already decided for me. Before I could protest, he was leading me toward the dance floor, guiding me through the moving bodies, until we were in the center of it all. The music was slow now, the kind that demanded closeness, that blurred the lines between familiarity and intimacy. I swallowed hard, forcing a breath, telling myself it was just a dance, that it meant nothing. His hands found my waist, settling lower than they should have. My body tensed at the contact, my pulse quickening in a way I did not like. I placed my hands on his shoulders, careful to keep space between us, but he did not mirror my restraint. He pulled me closer, not enough to make a scene, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. His fingers pressed lightly against my back, just enough to make my skin burn beneath the fabric of my dress. I wanted to step back, to create distance, but he held firm, his grip steady as he guided our movements. I forced a smile, hoping to mask the discomfort creeping into my chest, hoping that if I played along, this moment would pass. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered something I could not fully make out over the music. My stomach twisted, a quiet alarm ringing at the base of my spine. I finally pulled away, taking a step back, creating the space I had wanted from the beginning. He let me go, but not immediately, not before his fingers traced the fabric of my dress in a way that sent a shiver through me. His smirk did not fade, his expression unreadable, as he studied me. I muttered something about needing a drink, needing to find James, anything to get away. He said nothing, just watched as I turned and disappeared into the crowd. My heart was pounding as I moved through the room, my hands unsteady as I reached for a glass of water. I told myself I was imagining things, that it had been nothing, just a dance, just a misunderstanding. But the feeling in my chest did not ease, the weight of his touch still lingering on my skin. Later in the night, as I made my way back to James, I felt Ethan before I saw him. A brush of movement, a presence too close behind me. I stiffened, my breath catching as he passed, his voice low, meant only for me. "You didn't stop me earlier." The words sent ice down my spine, my stomach twisting in a way that made me feel unsteady. I did not respond, did not turn, did not give him the reaction he wanted. But I knew then, with a certainty I had been trying to avoid all evening, he was testing me. He wanted to see how far he could push before I would push back. I found James moments later, slipping my hand into his as if that simple contact could anchor me, could ground me. He smiled at me, oblivious, happy, lost in the warmth of family and celebration. I smiled back, but inside I felt something unravel, something shift. Ethan had crossed a line, and I was afraid it would not be the last time. The wedding had started winding down, the music softer now, the dance floor emptier than before. Guests had begun saying their goodbyes, hugging one another, promising to stay in touch even though most of them never would. James was standing with a group of relatives, his laughter carrying over the fading noise of the celebration. His tie was loosened, his posture relaxed in the way it always was after a few drinks. He had enjoyed himself, caught up in the warmth of family, completely unaware of anything outside of it. I watched him from across the room, forcing a smile whenever someone passed by, pretending everything was fine. Ethan was nearby. He had been near me all evening, appearing at just the right moments, speaking just enough to unsettle me without ever saying something outright inappropriate. I had done my best to ignore it, to pretend I was imagining things, but it was impossible not to notice. Every time I turned, every time I moved through the room, he was there. It was not a coincidence. I felt it in the way his eyes lingered too long, in the way his presence felt too intentional. James had barely noticed my absence throughout the evening. He had not asked where I had been, had not questioned when I stepped away. It was not that he did not care, but he had been too distracted, too comfortable in the familiarity of his family. I had told myself it was normal, that it made sense for him to enjoy the night without thinking too much about me. But now, standing there, feeling Ethan's gaze on me once again, I realized that was exactly what he had been counting on. James turned to me at last, his voice warm as he told me he needed to say a few more goodbyes before we left. I nodded, my heart pounding even though I had no reason to feel nervous. Ethan stepped forward before I could move, offering to walk me outside while James finished up. His voice was calm, friendly, so natural that there was no reason to refuse. I hesitated for only a second before nodding, knowing that saying no would make things more complicated than they needed to be. We stepped outside into the cool night air, the quiet a stark contrast to the noise of the wedding. The parking lot was nearly empty, a few cars still waiting for their owners, headlights flickering as drivers prepared to leave. I inhaled deeply, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind, hoping that whatever tension had been building throughout the evening would disappear now that the night was coming to an end. Ethan walked beside me, his steps slow, measured. It was a casual moment, something that should have been normal, but the awareness of his presence felt heavier than it should have. His hand brushed against my back, light at first, barely noticeable. Then, as we walked farther from the building, his touch became more deliberate, settling on the small of my back in a way that made me tense. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to face him. My voice was steady, though my pulse was anything but. I told him this was inappropriate, that he needed to stop. His expression did not change, did not shift in the way I had expected it to. There was no embarrassment, no regret. Instead, he smiled. Something small, something knowing. He told me that he knew I felt it too. That there had been something between us all evening, something neither of us had said aloud, but had been there nonetheless. My stomach twisted at his words, at the way he spoke, as if he had already decided what I thought, what I felt. I told him he was wrong, that this was nothing, that he had misunderstood. He laughed softly, shaking his head as if I was the one in denial. He stepped closer, his voice lowering, asking if I had noticed how James had barely paid attention to me tonight. He said it so casually, so confidently, as if it was a fact rather than a manipulation. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still, to hold my ground. I told him that it did not matter, that this had nothing to do with James. He smirked, tilting his head slightly as if amused by my response. He reminded me that I had not stopped him earlier, that I had not pushed him away when he had pulled me onto the dance floor, when his hands had lingered just a little too long. He said it as if that meant something, as if my hesitation had been a silent agreement. My hands clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms, as I told him again that he was wrong. For a moment there was silence between us, the only sound the distant hum of music still playing inside the hall. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, before finally stepping back. His smirk did not fade. His confidence did not waver. He nodded slightly as if acknowledging something unspoken, something I did not understand. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding, my skin cold, despite the warmth of the night. James appeared moments later, his voice light, as he asked if I was ready to go. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile, pretending everything was fine. I climbed into the car beside him, listening as he talked about the night, about his family, about things that no longer felt important. I responded when necessary, keeping my tone even, my words steady. But my hands were still shaking, my breath still uneven. As we pulled into our driveway, I told myself that the night was over, that I could forget about it now. I changed into my pajamas, wiped off my makeup, went through the motions of my normal routine. But as I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, unfolding the small piece of paper. My breath caught as I read the words written in neat, slanted handwriting. "You looked beautiful tonight. This isn't over." My hands trembled as I stared at the note, my mind racing, my pulse loud in my ears. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself that this was just another game, another way for him to test how far he could push. I could throw it away, I could pretend I had never seen it. I could convince myself that none of this had happened. But I knew better. I knew this was not over. The car ride home felt longer than it should have. The roads were empty, the night stretching on in silence except for the soft hum of the engine. James was talking beside me, his voice warm, animated as he recounted the highlights of the evening. He talked about how good it was to see family again, how much everyone had changed over the years, how he had lost track of time catching up. He laughed about how much his uncle had drunk, how his cousin's baby had stolen the show during the speeches. His words filled the space between us, but I barely heard them. I nodded when I needed to, murmured responses where necessary, but my mind was elsewhere. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against me, thick and suffocating. I kept my hands folded in my lap, gripping the fabric of my dress between my fingers, grounding myself. My heartbeat had not settled since we left, the discomfort in my chest making it hard to breathe properly. I tried to focus on James, on the normalcy of his voice, the casual ease of his words, but I felt disconnected, as if I was sitting beside him but not really there. The events of the evening played on a loop in my mind, the way Ethan had lingered, the way he had watched me from across the room, the way he had spoken in quiet, knowing tones, as if we shared some secret that only he understood. The dance, his hands pressing too firmly against my back, the way he had whispered in my ear, the smirk he had worn when I pulled away. His words at the end of the night, the ones that had made my stomach twist, the ones that had made me feel like I had lost control of the situation long before I even realized it. I had spent the entire night trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that he had not meant anything by his words, by his actions. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. The quiet confidence, the certainty that he had gotten under my skin, that he had created a space in my mind that I could not seem to close. I hated that he was right. I hated that, even now, I could feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the weight of his presence still lingering around me. James reached for my hand as he drove, giving it a light squeeze before returning it to the steering wheel. He was completely unaware, completely oblivious to the way my body tensed at the sudden contact. He was comfortable, at peace, enjoying the lingering warmth of the night, while I felt like I was unraveling. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to open my mouth and say something, anything to let him know that something was wrong, but the words would not come. They stuck in my throat, heavy and unmoving, as if speaking them aloud would make everything worse. I glanced out the window, watching the lights of passing buildings blur together. I counted the seconds between streetlights, tried to slow my breathing, tried to convince myself that I was safe now, that it was over, that Ethan was gone, that I would not have to see him again, that I could forget about all of this if I just forced myself to move on. But deep down, I knew better. The way he had spoken, the way he had looked at me, the way he had stepped too close, all of it told me that he was not done. That this was not just a passing moment, a one-time occurrence. He had been testing me, seeing how far he could go, and I had not stopped him soon enough. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The familiar sight of home should have been comforting, but it was not. Instead, it felt like stepping into a space that no longer belonged to me, as if something invisible had followed me inside. James stretched as he got out of the car, mumbling something about how exhausted he was, how he would sleep in late the next morning. I nodded, following him inside, my movements automatic, my mind elsewhere. I changed into my night clothes, wiping away my makeup, going through the motions of a normal evening, even though nothing about tonight felt normal. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the exhaustion of holding in so much tension for so many hours. I just wanted to sleep, to shut off my mind, to forget. I climbed into bed beside James, listening to the way his breathing slowed almost immediately, the way he settled so easily into rest while I remained wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I turned onto my side, shifting beneath the blankets, reaching absently into the pocket of my dress as I prepared to set it aside. My fingers brushed against something unexpected, something small, folded. My heart stopped. I pulled it out slowly, my breath catching as I unfolded the slip of paper, smoothing it out with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat, slanted, familiar. "You looked beautiful tonight. This isn't over." The words blurred in front of my eyes, my pulse thundering in my ears. My body went still, my breath coming in uneven, shallow gasps as the reality of it settled over me. He had been close enough to slip this into my pocket without me noticing. He had been near me at the very end of the night, even when I thought I had escaped his presence. I had never seen him do it, had never felt the note being placed there. And that terrified me more than anything else. This was not over. I clenched the paper tightly, my nails digging into it as I swallowed, the nausea rising in my throat. A shiver ran through me, my skin cold despite the warmth of the blankets. I glanced at James, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling the distance between us more than ever. He had no idea. He was sleeping soundly, unaware of the storm that had been building around me all night. I should wake him, I should tell him, I should let him see what I was holding, let him read the words that had shattered any illusion of safety I had left. But I did not move. Instead, I tucked the note beneath the pillow, hiding it away like a secret I was not ready to share. My mind raced, questions spiraling with no clear answers. What did he mean by this "isn't over"? Was it a threat? A promise? A warning? My stomach twisted at the thought of what could come next, at the possibility that this would not end just because the night was over. I pressed my eyes shut, trying to force sleep, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine in the morning. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that Ethan had taken something from me tonight, something I could not easily get back. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew that this was only the beginning.